Hey guys, welcome to another episode of KTM Summer Grill. My name is Simon Chapman, and today I'm joined by Connor O'Brien to talk about one of the big stories of 2021, of course, the sale of the Supercars Championship. And to run us through that is fellow Kiwi, Tim Miles, who was responsible for the initial sale of Supercars to Archer Capital and its subsequent sale most recently. So Tim, welcome on board and really pleased to have you here to run us through the whole deal.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Tim, give us sort of, I guess, some historical context to this. I guess this is something that's been brewing in the background for a while now, but maybe let's step back even further, I guess, to sort of the early 2010s when Archer Capital first came to own Supercars.
Yeah, good way to start it, mate. So in 2011, the sport, or 2010, the sport was owned 75% owned by the teams and 25% owned by SEL, which the legendary Tony Cochran was a major shareholder in. And SEL was a sports and entertainment business that looked after sports talent, events, and sponsorships. And the teams went car racing, and SEL provided those services. And arguably the sport outgrew SEL. It was definitely their biggest asset. And so in 2011, Tony Cochran decided that there was time for an ownership change, and we ran a process then where in the end the sport became majority owned by Archer Capital and minority owned by the teams, 65-35. And the sport had been on such a growth path, it was making $30-odd million at the time we sold it. And so the teams were getting 75% of that $30-odd million. And the speed of the growth that we were experiencing at that time, Tony Cochran and the board of Supercars, which was Ross Stone and Roland Dane, as the team's representatives, believed that the growth would continue, and the logic was that Archer would buy it, put a bunch of processes and systems and protocols around that, sort of corporatized it and took it away from being a founder-led business to a corporatized something that could then either be floated on the public stock exchange or sold at a later time. So Archer always owned it to sell it, if you like. But then what happened when the first media rights negotiation happened a couple of years after the sale, the media world had changed significantly. Channel 10 had been sold. Channel 9 had just paid more than they wanted to for the NRL. And so the new media rights deal wasn't what everybody was expecting. And as a consequence, the total income to the sport came down. And the impact of the teams was they had 35% of a smaller pie instead of 35% of a bigger pie. And so the teams suffered a little bit and the income they got from the sport then. And Archer did the right thing by the teams at that time. They introduced a grid fee and they topped the teams up to keep them operating. So they paid them over and above what they were entitled to as shareholders, as a recognition that without the teams putting on the show, there was no show. And that probably meant that Archer held the business for longer than they would have. They had a couple of half-hearted attempts to sell their own shareholding. And then at the beginning of 2020, February 2020, we looked at, Archer and the teams looked at engaging my firm to work for the group to try and find a new owner. And then we all know what happened in March 20 at the Grand Prix. So coronavirus hit, and obviously anything that was reliant on events, crowds, people in public spaces, was a massive question mark was thrown over it. So the process was stopped. The sports, so Sean and his team did a fantastic job of running the sport and keeping it profitable through that period. And the teams did a fantastic job of going on the road for that big long period that did at the end of 2020. But it certainly wasn't a time to be thinking about selling the sport. And then we revisited it again around the same time in 2021. Are we going to be able to sell the sport? And our feeling as the business representing the shareholders was, yes, we are. We'd performed better than rugby. We'd performed better than NRL, AFL, if you considered how our earnings had dipped in relative to those other sports, and we'd been more proactive with things like the E series, etc. So we felt that we'd be able to find a new owner for it, and we're engaged by both the teams and by Archer to go and do that.
And so, Tim, from the outside at least looking in, it felt like, like you said, there had been quite a while there where there had been some intent to sell, but it felt like from the outside that things really picked up around sort of mid-year. I think we first started getting a whiff of it sort of around Darwin sort of time, but I mean, what was sort of the catalyst for that? Why did all of a sudden it really seem to pick up pace and all these contenders sort of came out of the woodworks?
So that's pretty much process design. The way that we looked at it was we couldn't be on the market for a big long period of time and the destabilisation that would cause the sport. So we spent, I think we got engaged in March, and we spent from sort of March till June, July, preparing the business for sale, understanding the numbers, building forecasts, understanding what was going to happen potentially with calendars in the future years, when the media rights were going to come due, all those types of things. And we built together an information deck that we could share with bidders. And then around June, July, we started making contact with the bidders. And so the reason it felt like there's a lot of momentum was all of our engagement initially was happening very, very, very much. There's only three team owners that were aware of it, originally being the two team owners on the board plus Roland, as he'd been through the last process with us. And we got to July, last week of June, and we presented to the shareholders and said, we believe we can get this type of outcome if we run a process. And so then the shareholders approved for us to go out and start talking to the people who would become likely bidders for it. So that's where you saw the momentum. There's actually all the hard work that happened in the lead up to that, but that's where you guys saw the momentum.
How did you sort of land on the two final groups that we ended up with? Obviously, there was the consortium led by Peter Adderton, who had the likes of Paul Morris and Alan Gow involved, and then we had the other side of things, which ultimately I guess you could say won the bidding war, which is Barry Nettlefold of TGI and TLA Worldwide, and with ARG. So run us through sort of that process and how you landed on a group that you thought was the best fit to own Supercars.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, Simon, because we had two shareholder groups who could both say no, but neither could say yes, if that makes sense. We could get a price that was acceptable to Archer Capital, but if we had a partner that the teams didn't accept, then the teams would say no. We could get a partner that was acceptable to the teams, but if they came at a price that wasn't acceptable to Archer Capital, then Archer could say no. So we went we didn't go back to private equity again. The teams were very adamant that they wanted it to be with whoever its long-term owner would be. And so we went to quite a wide group, as you know, the consortium with Peter, Adderton and Paul, etc. Have ended up having News Limited and the Broncos as part of that consortium. But we'd initially gone to News Limited and the Broncos separately, because there's a lot of synergy between running a team like the Broncos and running Supercars with in the back office. So we'd spoken to them and to News Limited separately. Obvious logic to talking to News Limited, because we'd love to get better mainstream newspaper coverage, and as our owner of the sport, that would solve itself. So we spoke to them. Peter Adderton had put his consortium together and proactively come to us. Peter's been a mate of mine for many, many years, so I know him well, and know Paul well, and also been a mate for many years. So they came, and they seemed to me to be a very genuine group, because they had, if you like, almost the Tony Cochran equivalent in Peter. You had somebody whose character, style and energy would lead the sport. So I found that quite an exciting group to be dealing with. ARG had been 2 or 3 times prior to our engagement had expressed to Archer that if it was ever for sale, they'd like to be involved. And then the TLA or QMS Sports Media, which is led by Barclay, had approached Peter Wiggs to express interest in it, because they were trying to expand their sporting assets So on top of that, we had people like NASCAR, etc., that were on our radar, and other sports and entertainment groups globally that we'd dealt with when we sold the business in 2011. So we actually had a very large bidder pool at one stage. And then as we got through the process, we could see where some of the objectives of the bidder pool didn't meet the teams, or where the value that the bidder pool was looking at didn't necessarily meet the objectives of Archer. And so when the Broncos and the Adderton Consortium, when at sort of around the same time as they joined forces, John McMillan from ARG contacted me to let me know that he had approached TLA and wanted our approval for them to work together. And so we allowed, what was 4 bidders to become 2. And that sort of effectively created the shortlist, if you like, from where we went forward from there. Then we got to a point where the bids had to be acceptable to Archer. It was clear from the team's perspective that we had 2 groups that were buying it for the long term, with a view to growing and driving the sport. And initially the concept was for bidders to let us know how much they would offer for the Archer shareholding, and then let us know what their structure would be for the teams. But Roland particularly pushed very hard for the teams to be removed from the ownership, and to take a role the same as Formula One teams do, the same as NASCAR teams do. So getting paid for going racing as opposed to being a shareholder, and controlling decisions that the sport makes, because there's just too much conflict in that. And so we communicated that to both the bidder groups. In fairness to Peter and Paul and that team, they'd already identified that as the structure that they wanted, and the other group moved to the same type of structure. And so then we actually had apples for apples. We were then able to compare 2 bidders with the same structure for the teams, how much the team's going to get paid on an annual basis to go racing, and how much is Archer going to get paid, and that allowed us to select the final, the successful party out of that.
Can you tell us on who else was sort of in the mix at various stages? Like you mentioned NASCAR, which is kind of pretty cool. Like I think the Peregrine Corporation or Sam Jahin or that sort of thing was sort of, they'd sort of voiced some interest. Was there anyone else sort of note?
So Connor, we had non-disclosure agreements which are 2-way with all of those bidders, and so the people who you guys wrote about and got confirmed, I can confirm, but the people that you didn't and you didn't, I can't. but you've made some pretty good guesses.
What can you tell us, us and fans, about someone like a Barry Nettlefold, who probably not many people knew, at least in the supercars kind of circles, but now is in a really key role, obviously the chairman and pretty much the face of race. What can you tell us about Barclay?
So he's a sports person first and a business person second would be my way of describing him. He's everything he's done through his business career has had a sporting bent to it, probably with the exception of QMS Outdoor, which he founded. But with the exception of that, Swimming Australia, QMS Sports Media, TLA. So he's been very, very heavily involved in sports administration over many, many years. And he genuinely understands that the way for sports to be successful is to give fans access, and to I think under his stewardship, the drivers will become much more of a focus of the sport again, and a little bit more like it was in the late 90s, early 2000s, where the drivers' faces all over the sides of the trucks, etc. He's very much, let's make these guys stars, let's make them accessible, they're gladiators. We want to get the most out of that. He's also very keen on making the events better, stronger, and that was one of the reasons he loved the concept of partnering with ARG, because collectively they could work on, we've got they're not the custodians of the sport in Australia, but they've got such a massive influence on it. They've got to make sure that they keep the Shannon's types of events running with great content, but then they can use the right content at the right time in the supercar type events. So to me, he's a very energetic and passionate sports administrator who I think, absolutely no offence to the Archie guys and Peter Wiggs, all the teams at some stage during that process wrote to or rang and thanked Peter for his stewardship of the sport and how much he did for the sport. But I think Barclays bought it not for to make a financial gain out of owning an asset. He's bought it to make a bigger sport, and I think that's very much what his focus is.
I think one thing's for certain at the end of the day, if Supercars is ever going to get sold again, I think you're probably the bloke who's going to do it based on the track record.
Yeah, 2 times lucky. Well, things run in threes. I don't think it'll get sold again. Well, I certainly hope it won't. The plans that Barclays shared with us when he was presenting to the teams what he wants to do with the sport and how he wants to do it, with his group of people around him, I think it's pretty exciting. And that group, QMS Media, they own things like Delatier, which is a online sports marketing business. They own TV3 in New Zealand. They're a big group with a lot of synergy, and they can bring a lot of energy to the sport, through their other assets.
I think it's a fascinating time for Supercars, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, another key thing that I know a lot of people are really interested in is, of course, we've got the chairman sorted, we've got the new owners, we're going to have a new CEO. The early talk maybe about Shane Howard, who's been the long-time chief operating officer. I mean, again, Tim, I guess with that kind of, we're only talking, I guess, speculation at this point in time, but I mean, you've been around the sport a long time. Do you think Shane could be someone who would be a good fit there?
Oh, he's done it 2 or 3 times before, hasn't he? So the old silver fox. So look, I think he definitely is somebody that they should be looking at. They haven't confided in me who they would look at. One of the things I do think though is when you've got all of those assets that race are a part of the race consortium, so TV3, Delatier, QMS Media, etc. Whoever runs Supercars needs to have a lot of status within those groups so they can go and access the assets that they can bring to it. So that would be Shane's challenge, where if you look at somebody who had access to all those groups, they probably wouldn't be able to walk up and down the pit lane with the amount of respect that Shane's got. So, it will be a difficult decision for them to make, but probably more from being sport for choice than otherwise. I think that Shane's done a fantastic job for the sport over the years and would be a very logical choice.
For sure. I think we could probably keep talking about this all day. It's such a monumental moment for Supercars and for motorsport as a whole in Australia. I'm super excited about what the future holds for the category. It certainly sounds like there's some good direction behind the scenes there. So really appreciate your time, Tim, to run us through this massive moment in Supercars history.
My pleasure. Have a great break, you guys.
Thanks, Tim. Well, that concludes another episode of KTM Summer Grill. Stay tuned to speedcafe.com for another episode tomorrow. As part of this year's KTM Summer Grill, each week KTM is giving away the perfect summer beach pack, which includes an umbrella, cap, gym bag and key holder. To enter the draw, head to speedcafe.com or hit the link in the description below.